Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Kai once believed he was among the truly cursed, a man singled out by fate for suffering when a devastating injury abruptly ended the football career he had poured his entire youth into. On a rainy afternoon beneath gray, weeping skies, the final whistle of a high-stakes game marked more than just the end of 4 quarters, it heralded the death of his lifelong dream. In that one haunting moment, every ounce of ambition, every sacrifice, and every moment of triumph he had known turned to ash. The roaring crowds, the bright lights, the promise of greatness all dissolved into silence. What followed was a descent into a kind of living death, where Kai existed not as a man, but as a shadow of one. He withdrew into himself, too ashamed to face the world, too angry to seek help, too broken to believe he could ever be whole again. He was no longer celebrated or remembered, his name disappeared from headlines, from sports shows, from conversations. The world had moved on, and it had left him behind. But just when Kai thought every door had slammed shut forever, Drew appeared, not as a coach, not as a scout, not even as a doctor, but as something far more powerful, a believer. Drew offered Kai a chance, not in the form of empty words or patronizing sympathy, but with real action. He funded a cutting-edge surgical procedure that could restore Kai's mobility. It wasn't a miracle cure, and it didn't return him to the field, but it gave him something much more valuable, the ability to walk again, to move without pain, to reclaim agency over his own body. Drew didn't stop there. He opened a new path forward by bringing Kai into a paid internship program, an initiative that not only gave Kai a source of income but reintroduced him to structure, purpose, and dignity. Everything Drew did radiated compassion. He spoke to Kai not as a broken athlete, but as a young man with potential. He shielded him from judgmental colleagues. He introduced him as a protege rather than a charity case. Kai couldn't help but see him as more than a mentor. He saw a father figure, a kind of savior who had reached into the ruins of his life and pulled him out. In Drew's presence, Kai felt safe, seen, and, for the first time in a long time, valuable again. It was impossible not to wonder, on those quiet, solitary nights, if perhaps the rumors whispered online held some truth. Maybe there was a reason he felt so connected to Drew. Maybe blood called to blood. Maybe fate had woven something deeper between them than just gratitude and mentorship. But gratitude, for all its warmth, can sometimes obscure the truth like fog on glass. Over time, small details began to gnaw at the edges of Kai's certainty. Financial records he was asked to scan didn't match previous ledgers. Email threads were missing timestamps. There were inexplicable late-night meetings with shadowy figures, hurried whispers in hallways, hushed conversations that stopped the moment he walked into a room. At first, Kai brushed it off. He told himself it was the nature of politics, of business, of high-stakes philanthropy. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That the benevolent empire Drew had built was held together not by honor, but by deception. Then came the moment that shattered the illusion. While organizing files in Drew's office after a staff meeting, Kai stumbled upon a manila envelope half hidden under a stack of press kits. Inside were copies of wire transfers, contracts, and memos, each one a nail in the coffin of the image Kai had held so dearly. The documents outlined covert financial agreements between Drew and various shell organizations, many of which were under investigation for fraud and misappropriation of charitable funds. Drew wasn't just bending the rules, he was breaking them. And worse, he was using people like Kai as the face of his schemes, as proof of his so-called generosity while secretly profiting from programs meant to uplift the very communities he claimed to protect. Kai's breath left his lungs in one long, sickened exhale. The man he had revered wasn't a savior, he was a manipulator, a master of image management who had wrapped corruption in the language of redemption. Kai sat with the truth for days, trapped in a spiral of anguish. His mind rebelled against it. He told himself there had to be an explanation. Maybe Drew was being blackmailed. Maybe the documents were forged. Maybe he had found them too late and Drew had already tried to fix things. But in his heart, he knew better. The trust had rotted from the inside out, and now Kai stood on the precipice of a terrible choice. If he stayed silent, he would be complicit. He would be another cog in a machine built on exploitation. But if he spoke up, he would destroy the man who had given him everything. Worse, he would be betraying the closest thing he'd ever had to a father. Each night, Kai lay awake, hearing Drew's voice in his mind, replaying every conversation, every reassuring word, now stripped of meaning and poisoned with ulterior motives. He felt hollow, torn between two identities, grateful son or moral witness. Between loyalty and truth. Between the comfort of a lie and the pain of justice. In the end, it was the memory of who he used to be, before the injury, before the silence, before Drew, that gave him clarity. He had once been a fighter. He had once believed in fairness. And if Drew had truly cared for him, then he would understand that silence was not love. So Kai made his decision. He compiled every document, every shred of evidence, every email, every bank statement, and took them to Curtis, the one person he trusted to know what to do. Curtis asked no questions, offered no judgment. He simply nodded, took the files, and promised to take care of it. And when the reckoning came, it was swift and brutal. Drew was blindsided. The media turned on him overnight. Sponsors pulled out. Investigators descended. The public, once enamored with his story of redemption, now devoured him like wolves. Drew stood in front of the cameras, trying to maintain composure, but the pain in his eyes betrayed him. He kept searching the crowd, looking for Kai, perhaps hoping to find some fragment of their former bond. But Kai wasn't there. He couldn't be. Watching Drew fall would have been too much, even after everything. Because betrayal, even when justified, cuts both ways. Kai left town soon after. He didn't give interviews. He didn't issue statements. He simply disappeared into the quiet. He knew he had done the right thing. But the right thing didn't feel like victory. It felt like mourning. Like burying a piece of himself he could never recover. He had broken the cycle of silence and complicity, but in doing so, he had also broken something far more personal, the belief that love and truth could coexist. And so he walked alone, a man forever changed by the man he once believed in. The deeper Kai delved into the labyrinth of financial records, encrypted correspondence, and falsified documents, the more horrifying the reality became. Drew, the man he had once revered as a beacon of hope and second chances, had not only diverted funds from various charitable sources for personal and political gain, but had also used those very donations to quietly bolster his influence among high-ranking policymakers. The grants and goodwill he had received were not tools of compassion but weapons of manipulation, carefully wielded to craft a public image that no one dared question. What disturbed Kai the most was how flawlessly Drew had played his role. As a decorated veteran who had survived the psychological and physical toll of war, Drew had weaponized his trauma into a persona of philanthropic virtue, using his past suffering to silence skeptics and solidify a carefully cultivated mythos. But beneath the surface of valor and sacrifice, Kai discovered that Drew had orchestrated one of the most sophisticated embezzlement schemes he'd ever encountered. One fund in particular, the Veterans Recovery Initiative, was supposed to provide specialized support for former soldiers suffering from PTSD and physical disabilities. It had been hailed as a flagship effort by Drew, a program that earned him awards, interviews, and countless speaking engagements. In reality, only a fraction of the funds ever reached those in need. The rest were rerouted through a complex network of shell organizations and consulting firms, ultimately circling back to benefit Drew's lobbying efforts, personal ventures, and political alliances. With each damning revelation, Kai's soul withered under the weight of what he was uncovering. There were names on those documents. Veterans who had reached out for help and were denied support due to lack of funding, even as Drew attended gala after gala, parading Kai and others like him as success stories in a web of fabricated redemption. The betrayal cut so deep it made him physically ill. Every smile Drew had given him, every word of encouragement, now echoed with a sinister undertone, transformed into twisted evidence of manipulation. Kai stood at a crossroads, tormented by the impossible nature of his decision. He could choose silence and continue to enjoy the benefits of Drew's mentorship, living under the comforting illusion that the man was flawed but ultimately well-meaning. Or he could tear that illusion apart, expose the truth, and accept that doing what was right would mean irrevocably severing ties with the one person who had made him believe he still had a future. The choice wasn't just between truth and comfort. It was between saving others from the same fate or becoming complicit in a system that preyed upon the broken. The anguish Kai felt wasn't just moral, it was personal. He was about to dismantle the very foundation of trust he had built his healing upon, and in doing so, he would have to watch a man he once loved like a father fall in the most public and unforgiving way imaginable. That's when Curtis entered the picture, not as a savior, not even as a recruiter, but as a quiet voice of reason. Curtis had been watching Drew's rise with growing suspicion for months. He had seen the signs but lacked the proof to act. He didn't push Kai, didn't use threats or guilt. He offered Kai one sentence, and it was enough to tilt the balance of everything Kai had been grappling with. If you don't act, there will be more like you, more who are used, discarded, and lied to. That was all it took. That single, painful truth settled into Kai's bones and refused to be ignored. Days passed, then a week. Kai barely slept. He rehearsed what he would do 1,000 times in his mind, but nothing could prepare him for the moment itself. It was raining when he walked into Curtis's office, the same way it had rained the day he lost his career on the football field, the same way it had rained when he thought his life had ended. The weather mirrored the internal storm raging within him. In his hands, he carried a file folder heavy with consequence. Printed contracts with Drew's signature, financial ledgers showing the diversion of funds, wire transfers to untraceable accounts, even internal memos and audio clips from closed-door meetings where Drew casually discussed reframing the narrative and maximizing optics. It was damning. It was undeniable. It was final. He placed the file on Curtis's desk with a shaking hand. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Curtis's eyes met Kai's with solemn understanding. Both men knew what this meant. From that moment forward, there would be no going back, no undoing the damage, no repairing the relationship, no pretending that Drew was merely misguided. Kai wasn't just a whistleblower. He was the executioner of the very myth he had once clung to for survival. As Curtis flipped through the contents in silence, Kai stood still, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. It wasn't triumph he felt. It wasn't relief. It was grief. He had exposed a criminal, yes. But in doing so, he had also destroyed the last illusion he had about trust, about fatherhood, about the possibility that goodness could exist without shadows. Drew had built a house of mirrors, and Kai had smashed it to the ground. The shards cut both ways. The day Drew was summoned for formal investigation, the entire media landscape erupted with a kind of frenzy that blurred the lines between justice and spectacle. Headlines exploded across every major outlet. Hero or fraud, read one. Cain's fall from grace, screamed another. For years, Drew had been upheld as a symbol of redemption, a war veteran turned philanthropist, a man who had rebuilt his life and offered others the same chance. He was lauded in political circles, praised by celebrities, admired by veterans. His face had graced magazine covers and campaign posters. He had become a walking embodiment of resilience and benevolence. But now, those same journalists who once clapped him on the back with reverence began to sharpen their pens into spears. The tide turned swiftly. Supporters fell silent. Detractors celebrated vindication. And the public, ever hungry for scandal, watched with wide eyes and quick judgments. Inside the courthouse, Drew wore a calm mask, the kind of cold, practiced composure honed by years in the spotlight. He straightened his tie, kept his shoulders square, and answered questions with measured tones. But beneath that exterior was a storm of betrayal and devastation he couldn't articulate, not because of the accusations themselves, nor the impending collapse of his public empire. No, what cut him deeper than any allegation was the knowledge that the blade had been plunged by Kai, the one person he had once pulled from the edge. The boy he had seen potential in. The young man he had taken under his wing and elevated from obscurity to promise. He had seen Kai as more than a mentee. In some unspoken way, Drew had viewed him as his legacy, proof that his pain, his sacrifices, his supposed redemption, had meant something. And now, that very legacy had become the architect of his downfall. When the evidence was displayed, clear, irrefutable, devastating, Drew couldn't even pretend to defend himself. He didn't deny the transactions. He didn't fabricate excuses. Instead, his eyes searched the crowd, instinctively looking for the one face he knew wouldn't be there. Kai. His absence was as loud as any protest. Drew kept scanning the room in quiet desperation, hoping for a glimpse, a sign, a flicker of hesitation. But all he found was a hollow expanse of strangers, journalists, and spectators, none of them offering the solace of familiarity. Kai had chosen not to come. Not because he was afraid of confrontation, but because he no longer had the strength to witness the man he once believed in crumble under the weight of his own lies. After the scandal erupted and Drew's empire began to implode, Kai didn't return to the office. He didn't answer calls. He didn't issue statements. He vanished like mist, slipping into a self-imposed exile that was as much about survival as it was about penance. He had always known the consequences of his choice, but the reality of them proved far more punishing than he'd imagined. Righteousness did not bring relief. Justice did not come with peace. The world might have called him brave, might have applauded his integrity, but in the quiet hours of night, those accolades meant nothing. What echoed in Kai's mind were memories, vivid, painful, inescapable. Drew's smile as he handed him the rehabilitation paperwork. The firm handshake on his first day of the internship. The pride gleaming in Drew's eyes as he introduced Kai on stage, calling him the future. Those moments had once brought him hope. Now, they pierced his soul like shards of broken glass. He would lie awake, night after night, replaying every conversation, every shared laugh, every moment of camaraderie. He questioned himself relentlessly. Had Drew ever meant what he said? Had any of it been real? Or had he simply been another pawn, another carefully positioned symbol used to legitimize a grand illusion? Kai wanted to believe there had been truth in Drew's affection, that at least part of what they shared had not been a lie. But even that hope began to corrode under the weight of everything he now knew. He stopped trusting his memories. He stopped trusting his own instincts. And in that numbness, in that hollow space between regret and righteousness, Kai began to fade. He didn't return to his hometown. He didn't reach out to old friends. He wandered, quietly, anonymously, looking for something he couldn't name, a place, a purpose, a reprieve. In small towns and forgotten cities, he found temporary refuge. He worked odd jobs under false names. He walked for hours in the rain. He spoke little. He wrote even less. He became a man suspended in the aftermath of a moral decision that had left him both hero and orphan. Kai understood now that in the world he lived in, heroes could become villains with the exposure of a single document, and villains could wear the face of a father. He had learned, brutally and irrevocably, that good intentions don't always protect you from doing harm, and that truth, however noble, can leave deeper scars than lies ever could. He had done the right thing, yes. But what he had lost in the process would never be reclaimed. He had lost not just Drew, but the version of himself that had once believed in people, in redemption, in second chances. That Kai was gone, buried beneath court transcripts, news articles, and sleepless nights. And in his place stood a man who had learned that sometimes, truth is not a light that sets you free, it's a blade that cuts clean through every bond you ever thought was real. It doesn't heal. It doesn't absolve. It simply remains, like a ghost at the edge of your conscience, reminding you that justice has a cost. And sometimes, that cost is everything. In the end, there were no parades for Kai, no medals for courage, no final speech to bring closure. His reward for standing on the side of truth was solitude. The world moved on as it always did, headlines faded, new scandals emerged, and the media that once dissected Drew's downfall turned its attention elsewhere. Drew, stripped of his reputation and status, disappeared into a fog of legal proceedings and public shame. What remained were only echoes, of promises broken, trust shattered, and two men forever altered by a truth neither could outrun. Kai never returned to Port Charles, not even when the dust had settled. The city that had once given him a future had also taken his innocence. He carved out a quiet life somewhere no one knew his name, where he could wake each morning without the weight of whispers or judgment. But peace was elusive. It came in flickers, brief, quiet mornings when the sun rose through his window and the world felt still. And then it would vanish again with the sound of a distant news report or the memory of Drew's voice saying, "I believe in you." Those words haunted him most of all. He sometimes imagined what it might have been like if Drew had never betrayed anyone. If the man he had believed in was, in fact, as good as he seemed. In those moments, Kai let himself feel the ache of what was lost, not just a father figure, but a sense of belonging, of faith in something greater than himself. He had given that faith freely, and in the end, it had cost him more than he ever thought possible. And yet, Kai did not regret what he had done. Because despite the devastation, despite the loneliness, despite the void that had replaced the man he once looked up to, he had chosen integrity over comfort. He had refused to be a prop in someone else's performance. He had refused to be silent.